Good morning. This is the Sunday morning sermon for Black Rock Baptist Church for August the 11th of 2024. We're still working our way through the series of messages on the life of Moses. We're into number 9 today, a sermon entitled Stuck Between a Rock and a Hard Place. And we're looking today at Exodus chapter 14, verses 1 through 31. Have you ever found yourself in a predicament? We have a lot of word pictures in the English language that describe being in a predicament. We hear phrases such as, "Well, you've painted yourself into a corner now, haven't you?" Or you might hear the phrase, being caught between a rock and a hard place, being up against the wall, or being in a pickle. At least one person has defined a predicament as being a lawyer who specializes in suing doctors for medical malpractice, finding himself in need of major surgery. They say that's a predicament. Well, Moses and the people of Israel found themselves in a predicament. The Israelites found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea. There was nowhere to go. After the death angel's appearance resulted in the death of the firstborn among all the Egyptians, Pharaoh finally allowed the Israelites to go free, reluctantly. Exodus chapter 13, verse 18 tells us, "So God led the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt." Moses tells us how God guided the children of Israel in Exodus chapter 13, verse 21. He says, "And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night from before the people." This great pillar of began to lead the children of Israel on their journey. The pillar took on the appearance of smoke during the daytime and fire at night. The passage we're looking at, as I said, in Exodus chapter 14, shows us 4 things that teach us about God's plan. And that's what I want to focus on today. First of all, God's plans are not always logical. In Exodus chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, God ordered a change of direction, which many of the children of Israel must have thought seemed strange at worst and risky and dangerous at the most. Now, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, that they turn and camp before Pi Haron, between Midgal and the sea, opposite Baal Zephon. You shall camp before it by the sea." The children of Israel were in effect asked to backtrack on their journey, to go back in the same direction they had just traveled. And their course was to take a direction in which a very short time it would place them with the Red Sea on one side, trackless wilderness on the other side, and in front of them a barrier of mountains. They were boxed in. There would be no escape. It was like running for your life and all of a sudden realizing that you've turned down a dead-end street. They can't go back. They can't go forward. The future looks impassable. The present looks impossible. But you need to understand that they've been led there to this place. They stand in that place not because Moses said to go there, or not by a coincidental wandering in the wilderness. They've been led there by God Himself. Often God seems to place His children in positions of profound difficulty, leading them into a wedge from which there's no escape, designing a situation that no human judgment would have permitted if it had been previously consulted. The cloud directs them there. You may be involved in a situation like that in this very hour in your life. It seems perplexing and mysterious, but it's perfectly right. It's a platform for the display of God's almighty power and grace. Not only will He deliver you, but in doing so, He will give you a lesson that you would never forget and you would never learn any other way. God's plans don't always seem logical to us. Secondly, God's plans are always made in advance. And for that, we look to God was not surprised. He knew the end of this situation before it ever began. In verse 3, we're told there, Pharaoh will say to the children of Israel, they are bewildered. The wilderness has closed them in. Then I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them. And I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. And they did so. God says to Moses, now look, here's the plan. Pharaoh will hear that you are wandering back and forth in the desert, and he will think, now's my chance. I'll trap them, and they're not going to be able to escape. That, Moses, is the trap that I will set for Pharaoh and his army. God has arranged this ahead of time. He always does. According to verse 5 through 8, Pharaoh fell for God's plan. Pharaoh pursued the children of Israel with 600 chariots, and in verse 9 we're told he overtook them camping by the sea beside Pi-hahiroth. And when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Why did the same Israelites who have just witnessed the remarkable power and deliverance of God, why are they now fearful and beginning to murmur against Him? In their defense, it should be noted that not all the company that were traveling together were Israelites. Exodus chapter 12, verse 38 tells us that a mixed multitude came out of Egypt with Israel. Secondly, Israel didn't have any written scripture that they could pick up and point to in this time in their history. And thirdly, as slaves, they had always lived on the edge of subsistence, and they were easily given to being fearful. The text says the Israelites were not just afraid, it says they're very afraid. And I believe that doesn't even do justice to the terror that they felt. Israel's response is to give in to their fear. We need to notice that fear does terrible things. In verses 11 to 12, it says, then they said to Moses, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us so, to bring us up out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, let us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would be better for us to serve the Egyptians than we should die in the wilderness. Israel was afraid because they had their eyes on the Egyptians, not on the Lord. Fear causes them to distort the truth, to be ruled by doubt rather than be ruled by faith. Their statement that it would have been better to have served the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness exhibits a remarkably short memory. But then, don't we as believers sometimes act as if we regret having stepped out in faith when we see what's actually involved? The psalmist records in Psalm 106, verse 7 and following, it says, "Our fathers in Egypt did not understand your wonders. They did not remember the multitude of your mercies, but rebelled by the sea, the Red Sea. Nevertheless, he saved them for his name's sake, that he might make his mighty power known." It's interesting to consider that Israel had trusted God for their deliverance, but not for the circumstances they find themselves in now. That's nothing new. David despaired and said, I will perish one day at the hand of Saul. Elijah had to hide in a cave, and while he's there, he asked to die. If we are Christians, we have trusted him to save us from our sin, but all too often we will not trust him with the circumstances of our life. There are lots of things that cause us to not trust God. When a diagnosis of a disease for which there is no cure is given. When we have more month than we have money. We have a child who refuses to do right. We have a spouse who has rejected us. When we lose our job, there are lots of things that cause us to not trust God. Some people have attempted to explain away the miraculous aspects of the crossing of the Red Sea. We hear the miraculous things that God has done, and we don't trust. Gabby Aylesworth, a missionary to China more than 50 years ago, she was forced to flee when the Japanese invaded. But she could not leave her work behind. With only one assistant, she led more than 100 orphans over the mountains toward free China. In her book, The Hidden Price of Greatness, Ray Benson and Renalda Huxinger tell of what happened to Gladys. During Gladys' harrowing journey out of war-torn Yangchang, she grappled with despair as never before. After passing a sleepless night, she faced the morning with no hope of reaching safety. A 13-year-old girl in the group reminded her of their much-loved story of Moses and the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. "But I'm not Moses," Gladys cried in desperation. "Of course you aren't," the girl said. "But Jehovah is still God." When Gladys and the orphans made it through, they proved once again that no matter how inadequate we feel, God is still God. We can trust him. When the situation seems impossible, just remember to have a personal confidence in God. Practice obedience and understand that God has a purpose in all the experiences we have with him. Number 3, God's plans do not need our help, only our obedience. God's answer through Moses was to the murmuring of the Israelites is found in the beginning of verse 13. This is God's answer to the murmuring of the people. Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace." God's instructions to Moses had been fourfold, four things. First of all, don't be afraid, fear not. He instructed the people, first of all, to not fear. Don't be afraid. Secondly, he says, stand still. That might be better understood if it was said, stand firm, reflecting the faith and the confidence in the delivering power of God. Stand still. Watch was instruction number 3. Moses says, see what the Lord will accomplish for you today. God does not need your help. You don't need to fight. You need to stay out of the way. Just watch him do his work. And then fourthly, the fourth instruction was to keep silent. Hold your peace. Often the hardest for us to do is this, because we feel we just have to tell someone about our predicament that we're in. But the only one who can do anything about our predicament already knows all about it. He's waiting for us to look to him and just be silent. All of these instructions are the direct opposite of our natural human response to panic. First, we are afraid. Second, we run. Third, we fight. And fourth, we tell everybody that'll listen to us all about our problem. God now speaks to Moses, and he says in verse 15 and 16, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. But lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea." Literally, God told Moses, stop praying and start moving. There's a time to pray, yes. But when we have received instructions, we need to stop praying and start moving. Fourthly, God's plans are not limited to what is humanly possible. In verse 21 and 22, we read, "Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on the right hand and on their left." Some people have attempted to explain away this miraculous aspect of the crossing of the Red Sea, that it's something else that happened. One popular view is that the Israelites crossed the Red Sea in a generally shallow and marshy area, which had been cleared of water and made dry by the natural action of strong wind. Well, okay, that's you want to tell me about that, but the difficulty with that reasoning is that this is where indeed, or if this were indeed merely just a shallow water, a shallow area of the Red Sea, it's difficult to understand how the Egyptians could have drowned. How wide an area would need to be provided for crossing is not given in the text. It's not saying what that area was. But here is something to think about. To get the 3.5 million Israelites through the Red Sea in one night would be quite a feat. If they were going through the Red Sea double file, that double file line would be 800 miles long. and it would take 35 days and nights to get through. So they had to have a space in the Red Sea that was somewhere about 3 miles wide. So they could walk 5,000 abreast. Walking 5,000 abreast, they could then get through the Red Sea in one night. The conclusion to the story is told to us beginning with verse 23. The Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and his horsemen. Now it came to pass in the morning watch that the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and he troubled the army of the Egyptians. He took off their chariot wheels so that they drove them with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians, on their chariots and on their horsemen." And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and when the morning appeared, the sea returned to its full depth, while the Egyptians were fleeing into it. So the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. When the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them, not so much as one of them remained. But the children of Israel had walked on dry ground in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall to them on the right hand and on the left. So the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. The return of the water brought the end of the Egyptian force that had committed itself to pursue and destroy the children of Israel. Verse 31 reveals, "Thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt. So the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses." Well, in closing, I want you to see something about that coming of the Red Sea and the closing, the opening, the closing of the Red Sea was all part of God's plan. It was just as much a part of God's plan as the opening of the Red Sea. A predicament in God's hand is only a highway to a promised land. Why does God allow these predicaments to happen in our lives? Because it often takes those tight places of life to get us to look up to Him for help. It may be that you've developed a rather materialistic lifestyle. Like Moses and the children of Israel, you've rubbed shoulders with the folk in Egypt for most of your life. You work with the Egyptians. You think like them. You read their newspapers. You listen to their music. You do commercial battles with the Egyptian entrepreneurs. You're in the competitive world of the Egyptians, so it's only natural that you react like that. Well, that's the crossing of the Red Sea. Israelites stuck between a rock and a hard place, and they continue to see God at work in their lives. We'll pick this up again next week as we continue in this series on the life of Moses. Until then, God bless, and let's continue to exchange prayers on a daily basis. God bless.